I believe, Pastor George, your words have power. I really do think that. It was amazing once you said, let there be a time of silence. It just all got silent, even that noise. I don't know. There's something to it. I gotta have you in my house sometimes, I think. But no, it's always good to be led in a time of prayer like that, and just appreciate you, Pastor George, and all that you're doing for Hope here. Well, as a pastor, anytime somebody gets to know me and they find out that this is what I do for a living, there's a question that I find that it's a thread across every conversation I have when they find out I'm a pastor. Can you guess what that question is? What does the Bible say about fill in the blank? And so I thought, why not better than to just do a series on it, and let's just get this out of the way, right? What does the Bible say about? And I'm excited about this series as we move through different themes and topics that are really relevant to our culture, and they have a perspective. Why not look at what God has to say about it? That's how I feel. And so we're going to be moving through this for the next 4 or 5 weeks. And today, I'm especially excited for the topic we're talking about today. There was a child who asked his mother, he said, Mom, how are people born? So his mother said, well, Adam and Eve, they made babies, then their babies became adults and made babies, and so on. Then the child went to his father, a scientist, and asked him the same question. And he told him, we were monkeys, then we evolved to become like we are now. The child ran back to his mother and said, Mom, you lied to me. His mother replied, no, your father was talking about his side of the family. Yeah, I like that one. I'm going to use that one day. Thankfully, I don't have that division in our house, but it's the big question today. Did God make man, or did man make God? That is man in the image of God, or is God in the imagination of man? Is man just an animal, just a clever creature, or is there more to us than maybe just than what meets the eye? That is the question we are pondering, and that is what we're going to be diving into today. We're going to be looking at, what does the Bible say about atheism? What does it say about atheism? And before we really dive into the biblical perspective, I think it's important for us to understand the atheistic perspective. How atheism views our world today and those who follow a religion, a creed, or God, as we would put it in our context. You know, you may be surprised to find that actually in the early church period, the Romans believed that Christians were atheists. And the big reason for this was because they didn't serve the gods, the many gods that the Romans had in that time. The culture into which the church was born was really not a friendly one. They were not inclined to be in favor of religious diversity, which we kind of see today. So when Christianity began to grow, it was not met with much approval. As a matter of fact, the Roman government considered this new Jewish sect as a subversion to their state religion. If you didn't believe in the Roman gods, it was considered heresy. It was considered impiety, and it was also considered a capital crime. It wasn't until about the late 300s AD where things began to shift. An emperor called Constantine, named Constantine, had a dream. And in that dream, he had a vision of Jesus Christ. And from that moment, he made Christianity the dominant religion of that time. And it has continued to persist even into the modern worldview in the Western world, even to this day. But as the modern world has been ushered into place around the 1800s, it was then that atheism began to take a prominent role in the intellectual world. The word atheist, it's a Greek word meaning without God, without theist God. It's a scenario in which one believes that we live in a world that is without a God, without a creator, without an intelligent designer. But I think we even see a different kind of atheism taking place today, which we may get to a little bit later. But as the rise of atheism came in the 1800s in the intellectual world, the criticism of Christians began to increase. And to be fair, not just of Christians, but really of any major religion in our world today. It was seen that religion was the problem of all the problems that we see in our world today, or most of the problems that we see in our world today. It was claimed that Christians were really uncritical thinkers. They didn't think strongly about their faith or their belief. They didn't really know what they were getting themselves into. Maybe they inherited it from their parents, and they don't really have a real understanding or grasp of what they're believing. It was believed by many atheists, and even to this day, they were wasting their life on wishful thinking, that we revere a book with glaring inconsistencies, bizarre mythology, and inaccurate history. As a matter of fact, such thinking caused a man that you may have heard of by the name of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, he concluded that religion is just the opium of the masses. You may have heard of that quote. It is the opium of the people. It is a drug to help a person get by. It is used to dull the pain caused by reality. In other words, religion was being used as a crutch, something for weak people to just lean on in times of their adversity or their struggle. And for Karl Marx and many atheists, it's believed that if people really want happiness, they need to give up what is an illusion, unreliable, to experience what is real. That is, in a nutshell, basically the atheistic perspective. There's more to it. We don't have time to unpack all of it, but in a nutshell, that is basically how atheists perceive the world today. And it's how they perceive Christians and those who would follow a God in any religion. But I believe for most of us growing up in the church today, that's maybe not how we've come to a place in our life where we may be leaning towards that position. See, for some of us, as we've grown up in the church, we've come to believe in Jesus the same time we come to believe in Santa. And along the way, you begin to ask adult questions about your childhood faith. And what ends up happening a lot of times, and this is where the church, I think, fails, especially our young people and those growing up into this world, is they begin to get faith-based answers to their fact-based questions. And somewhere along the way, as we're driving down the road, it just comes to us. And we just say it out loud. I don't think I believe anymore. I don't think I can go there anymore. Maybe for some of us, whether watching online or here in person today, it's on the other side of the coin. Maybe some traumatic event happened, some experience, some prayer wasn't answered, something just didn't go right, or you view the world on the outside and you just can't reconcile how a good and loving God would allow something like this to happen in your life or in the life of somebody else. And you begin to ask those questions, and all you're met with is faith-based answers to fact-based questions. But this time, it's not just, I don't believe anymore. You've come to the point where you say, I can't believe anymore. And my heart truly goes out to those who are wrestling in that kind of a place. Because the reality is, the closer we lean towards that area of our life, I believe the more and more we begin to actually lose sight of what is real, and contrary to what Karl Marx would say. And so, let's take a look at what the Bible has to say about this. Because my hope for those of you today who are maybe listening online, maybe you stumbled across it on YouTube, or maybe you're even in here in person today, and you find yourself drifting more and more towards the atheistic worldview. It seems appetizing for whatever reason. My hope here for you today is that you would just open your heart and eyes to see what it is God has to say about this. And maybe, just maybe, be brought back and to a viewpoint that I believe can help you to see reality a little bit more clearly. So in order to see what the Bible has to say about atheism, I want to take you to Romans chapter 1 today. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Romans chapter 1 today. There's many places you can go in the Bible concerning this topic today. I think this is probably one of the most clearest that we can go to find what the Bible has to say about atheists. We're going to be starting in verse 18 there in Romans chapter 1. Paul is obviously writing to some churches in Rome. And in Romans chapter, I would encourage you to just read this over a cup of coffee this week, the whole entire chapter. We obviously don't have time to go over all of it. It is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. I think Romans 8 is probably my favorite, to be fair, but Romans 1 has a whole lot of good stuff in it. And Paul begins by talking to many of the churches there in Rome about a gospel that has come into his life, a gospel he's not ashamed of proclaiming. And that is Jesus risen from the dead. And he goes on to say that the righteous, they shall live by faith. And then he goes into this argument, because I'm sure there are many who were thinking, well, that's easy, Paul, to just live by faith. But how do I know God really exists? And so he goes into this argument in verse 18, and that's where we're going to start today. And he says this right after verse 17, where the righteous shall live by faith. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." Now, I'm going to just give you a little warning here. Paul gets into some heavy theology here. He begins to kick us off with this idea of the wrath of God. And you might say, what does that have to do with atheism? But it has to really tie into the larger argument of Romans 1, as I think you'll see. The wrath of God Paul referring to here is not some overt kind of wrath. It's not something you're going to see, but it's actually something you don't see. The kind of wrath that Paul is talking about here is God taking his hands off a society, off a culture, and letting them chase after whatever it is their hearts desire. And some of those things that you see are found at the end of this chapter. I'll just name a few. But some of those things that Paul is talking about here in the unrighteousness and ungodliness of a society is things like murder and strife and deceit and maliciousness and gossip, people who invent evil, disobedient to parents, they're heartless and ruthless. And listen, we live in a culture now that I'm finding is living more and more into this each and every day I watch the news. You with me on that? And it scares me in some ways. It does. I just saw the other day on the news an 8-year-old boy who was taught by his parents in New York to go and steal right from a local store, $600. We've seen crime rates double in some cities, New York City, Chicago, for juveniles just over the last 3 years. I don't know about you, but it's got me wondering what's going on here. The wrath of God here spoken of is one where God just takes his hands off. And why is he taking his hands off of society, off a nation? Well, it's because there, you see in verse 18, they, by their unrighteousness, are suppressing the truth. And what is that truth? Well, we see that in verses 19 and 20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Man, that's a key verse. Verse 19. God has made plain to us about who he is, because he has shown it to us. You know, I find though, we tend to make things more complex than they should be. We tend to be the ones who make things really unclear about who God is, about his existence. I see it in the world today where many, many smart, brilliant people making things more muddy than they should be. to fit a narrative. I'm reminded of a story that took place through a guide. He was a guide in a museum. He was showing some visitors around the museum, and he was bringing some of the folks that he was leading in that museum around seeing different things, and he came to one particular fossil, and he said, that fossil in the glass over there is 2,000,009 years old, he told them. Someone asked, admiring this, someone asked, how can you date that so precisely? The guide said, that's easy. I've been working here 9 years, and it was 2,000,000 years old when I came. But that's how we see things in this world today. All in an effort to what? I believe to suppress the truth. That there is a God, and that he has made it plain, and we are accountable to that maker one day. But men go to great lengths to make this thing all muddy, complex, in order to suppress that truth. This is just a funny little example, but we have gone to some pretty long lengths in order to suppress that truth. And what is it that God has made plain to us? What is it that God is saying about this viewpoint that we're looking at today? Well, we see that in verse 20. Paul goes on and says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since what? Ever since the creation of the world, and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Wow, that's how God has made it plain to us. I love what Abraham Lincoln said. He said, I can see how it might be possible for a man to look down upon the earth and be an atheist, but I cannot conceive how he could look up into the heavens and say, there is no God. Wow. The order of the cosmos, under the microscope and through the telescope, show us something pretty amazing, I believe. It is Psalm 19 that says, the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky his handiwork. Day by day pours forth speech, night by night makes him known. Brothers and sisters, God has made it plain, simple, understandable, and all we need to do is look. You know, if you take, for instance, the human eye, have you ever studied the human eye and all of its intricacies and complexities? It's actually, matter of fact, Charles Darwin, who wrote this in his book, a well-known atheist, in his book, The Origin of the Species, said, when contemplating the miracle of the eye, he said, to suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. And that's coming from an atheist. If that doesn't do it for you, how about, and let me just stop there too, because you got to ask yourself how the lens and the retina, the optic nerve, and all the other parts that play a role in seeing not only appeared from nothing but evolved into interrelated and working parts. If that isn't enough for you, maybe DNA would be. DNA, it's a code, a language of the highest order. The language of DNA it's a molecular language. It's made up of nucleotide letters. And the DNA of us, it's a blueprint that tells a step-by-step how to assemble lifeless chemicals into a complete organism. From one cell to trillions. All working together to create what we see functioning today. All with a unique step and a unique code for them. And how those things could come together based on its own is beyond me. Maybe that's not enough for you. How about the human microbiome? You're going to get a science lesson today. You didn't know that, but that's what you're getting today. How about the human microbiome? I studied this, and I found this to be amazing. Over 10,000 species of bacteria, fungi, and other microbes, numbering around 100 trillion, share our bodies. Your skin is like a rainforest. Your intestines teeming with different species like an ocean. You have 10 times more microbial cells than human cells, and they weigh up to around 3 pounds. And actually, experts say that these microbes, they provide a wide range of metabolic functions that humans lack on their own. And they work to keep us healthy. So in other words, we can't live without them. It's really a symbiotic relationship. There's a professor, a biologist, I should say, by the name of Stephen Jay Gould. He described humans as a glorious accident of evolution, which required 60 trillion contingent events. And that's not an exaggeration. That would require more than 36 necessary events per day, each day, for 4.55 billion years, just to get Homo sapiens. And conveniently, each of these 36 daily events had to occur in the right place, at the right time, in the right sequence. You tell me who has to have more faith when it comes to believing whether or not there is a God or there isn't. Listen, just to give you an analogy that might help break this down for you a little bit more and make this a little bit easier. If you would take the parts of a new car and fly them at a height of 10,000 feet and then dump them out, you would have to have them assemble themselves into a car before they hit the ground. That is the likelihood. Now, I know what some would say in response to this. The evolutionists or the atheists would say, well, you just don't have enough time. Okay, fine. Drop it from 100,000 feet. Will they assemble themselves any better into a car? No. Very unlikely. And that is what it takes to believe in the no God scenario. That is, I believe, why Paul says to the Romans, to those churches in Rome, God has made it plain. He has shown it to you. That his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature, it's clearly perceived. There is no excuse. We have really muddied the waters. Now, I know there are some that may say in response to this, you know, Jay, that's not what I really have a problem with. Have you seen all of the atrocities in the world? Have you seen all of the things that have been done in the name of God? Where is God's divine nature and power in that? And you know, while I would admit that yes, a lot of things that are done in the name of God are terrible, and sometimes, yes, the enemy loves to wear the jersey of the opposing team in order to look as though he is one of us when he's really not. I know there is truth in that, and I know that there is evil that exists in this world and that does it in the name of God. We still can't forfeit and throw the baby out with the bathwater. I love what Alistair McGrath, a former atheist, I love what he said about this. He was in a debate with an atheist named Christopher Hitchens. And he said this. He said, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen. Not simply because I can see it, but because by it I see everything else. He went on to say, I will gladly concede, because I think Mr. Hitchens is right on this, that there are some forms of religion that are pathological, that damage people. For every one of these atrocities, which must cause all of us deep concern, there are 10,000 unreported acts of kindness, generosity, and so forth arising from religious commitments. McGrath concedes the error of many a religion, but does not give up on his faith because of it. And I think that can be said for many of us. God has made it plain. His power, his divine nature are clearly perceived if we will only consider the evidence. And what is that evidence? Well, we looked at it. It's the world we live in. It's the bodies we possess. It's the minds that think. I believe this is what the Bible has to say about this particular topic. But Paul doesn't end his argument there. See, what Paul ends up going on to talk about is the result of this mindset, of this scenario, if it continues to play out in our life and in those around us, in a society, in a culture. He goes on to say, so they're without excuse in verses 21 to 23, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Have you ever had a bad exchange in life? I'm sure you have. We all go there from time to time. We've all been there. But I would call this a mad exchange. You see, Paul goes on to talk about how even brilliant people who don't honor God, they miss the whole purpose of life and are thereby fools. And I've seen that. But what it eventually results in is in one of the most basic sins, idolatry. Idolatry. And what Paul is expressing here is what I just said a minute ago, a mad exchange. And you can see here where Paul is contrasting two things. This madness, it's the evidence of a terrible bargain that we settle for. Exchanging the weight and the reality of God's glory for images made to look like something else. The word there that Paul uses of the immortal God and mortal man, it's a play on words in the Greek. And what Paul is basically saying is we are exchanging the incorruptible. We are exchanging the immortal for something corruptible and mortal. We are exchanging it for human beings and animals. I love what Vine writes about this. He says, man is essentially constituted a worshiper. If he abandons the worship of God, some other object will be found to take the place of the Creator. You see, it's not a matter of if we're going to worship, but it's a matter of what we're going to worship. We as human beings, our souls are vacuums. Something will need to fill the space, whether it's ourselves, somebody else, or something we can see. And Paul is saying if we ultimately subscribe to this worldview and we chase after it, and it's where we plant our feet, eventually we will come to the place of this mad exchange where we take this incorruptible, immortal, pure, beautiful thing called God, and we exchange it for something that isn't worth our time and our energy and our focus, but it's where we will go when we ultimately find ourselves consumed by it. What does the Bible say about atheism? Well, I think there's a lot of grace involved in this. I know there's a lot of people hurt in the church, just been hurt in general. There's been a lot of people, I know, asking questions. And there's nothing wrong with wrestling with those questions, and there's nothing wrong with having those doubts. But when we look at it from a biblical perspective, I hope you can see today that God has made it plain. And my prayer for you this morning as the worship team comes up and as we begin to wind down our time here in God's Word, my prayer for you today is that you would then begin to seek the God of the Bible, if you haven't done so already. And that you would begin to just maybe place your trust in a man who walked this earth, who historians have attested about, who many have wrote about, as we see in the Bible and outside the Bible, a man who walked this world in a perfect way and eventually would go to a cross where he would spread his arms for the whole world to make it plain for all of us that God is love and that he came in order to restore us back to him and to restore into our lives a focus and a worship of something that is truly worthy, that being himself, the greatest good in the universe. He has made it plain to us that he exists, that he's real, and that he wants to be a part of your lives. So if you're watching today, maybe you stumbled across this on YouTube, I don't know. Maybe you've just been watching all along. Maybe you're here today and you've been wrestling with this. I know this. If you ask God to show you the truth, if you truly want to seek him with your heart, he'll bring you there. Oh, he doesn't do it through conventional means. He doesn't do it through the ways that this world would like it to be done. But he will move because he loves you that much. And he's made it plain to us that he wants to be involved in your life and that he wants you to worship him, the one who's worthy. Would you go with me in prayer this morning? Father, I thank you for what your word says about this particular topic we're looking at today. God, for some of us, it's a hard word. I know. I just want to preach your word. I don't want to fancy it up, make it a message, Lord, that doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. But God, this morning, I pray for those who are watching online or here in person today and they're struggling, they're wrestling with your existence in their life, your realness, whether or not you even exist. Lord, I pray that they would come to the realization that you did create this world and you did create us for a purpose. Father, I pray we'd find that purpose through your Son, Jesus Christ. God, stir our hearts, move us. Not so that we have just a blind faith that has just been inherited by our parents, but Lord, I pray that this faith would be based on reason. I pray that this faith would be a step of faith in a direction towards you because of what your word has spoken and spoken over us. God, may it become a real, authentic faith in what you've done for us through your Son. And we thank you for this time, and we just leave it all to you now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Will you stand with us as we continue?